My name is James Williams, Professor of French here at Royal Holloway, and I'm going to be talking about one of my favourite modules that I teach, which is French cinema, from Modernism to the Postmodern, and it's a second-year course. So what do we do in this module? Well, we're looking at the length and breadth of French cinema, taking 4 specific periods. And what are we doing? We're trying to kind of, first of all, get a sense of their formal features, how they develop French cinema formally, aesthetically, how they engage with the period in which they were produced, the historical period. And a running theme is going to be how they engage with the reality, the contemporary reality of the period. And they do so in very different ways, as we'll see. So the first period is the 1920s. This is the avant-garde period, when we had very different sorts of artists, photographers, visual artists now working in cinema to experiment, to see what the medium could now produce, so to get to the possibilities of cinema. And often these films have no real storyline. They're often very abstract. They can go into dream worlds, so it's all very strange, it's very exciting, but often very opaque. But those are questions that we will have to sort of explore as to the extent in which they are engaging with reality or maybe kind of hiding away from it. We will be talking in that period also about the so-called primitives of the first years of French cinema, people like Lumière, Méliès, who gave us a sense of a tradition of documentary and also a sense of fiction. Lumière, Méliès. So we're going to be using those 2 poles in the discussion of these 1920s films, and also carrying on thinking about these questions, these 2 poles, as we go through the course. The next period is the 1930s. Very different, a very dark period in French history, very turbulent period as sort of war is in the air. And we're now into the period of sound cinema, and we now have what's called the golden age of French cinema. These are big narrative films with big stars. This is when French cinema was setting itself as the primary cinema in the world, beating Hollywood. That was the aim. So we have now these big, wonderful films, amazing actors, but the films are very dark in tone. They're shot in black and white, still, we're not into colour yet. And they're very dark in the way that they kind of think about possibilities for the characters. They're often on the margins. Where can they go? There's clearly a sense of uncertainty about their lives. It's very pessimistic. So this is a kind of sort of film noir, dark black film both formally, black and white, shadows, and also in mood. Then we skip the war and we go into the end of the 1950s. We're into the period of the new wave, la nouvelle vague. Literally, and this is a new movement in French cinema. It's essentially youth cinema, and it's a youth cinema which is going against the films that have been made in the 1950s, which were often literary adaptations and quite staid and traditional. New wave now is going to explode French cinema, and we're going to get these new directors with untrained, unprofessional actors shooting outside on the streets of Paris and giving us a sense of reality, of this new reality of the period, which is the Fifth Republic in France. It's youth culture, it's consumerism. This is now a kind of documentary to some degree of that period. And one film in particular is Breathless, à bout de souffle, by Jean-Luc Godard, which symbolizes this kind of sense of this breathless engagement on the hoof with reality as it's happening. And then we move forward to the 1980s, and we're into something which is called, first of all, the postmodern. If we talk about the new wave as modernism, when French cinema becomes truly global and is, in a sense, a distinctive film period, a movement, a modern period in global cinema, we have, first of all, films which kind of go back to that period of the new wave, but do so in very different ways, because they're now shot more in the studio with big production effects and famous actors. And so they're citing new wave elements, but doing it in a very stylized way, a super stylized way. It's called the cinéma du look, the cinema of the look, of spectacle. And we use that as a point of contrast with what is the focus of this final period, which is a new engagement with a new realism. And this is the reality of France up to this day, which is a changing country, a country fraught with problems, poverty, unemployment, especially unrest in the suburbs and the banlieue of France, outside the main cities. We have now films engaging directly with that experience. So we have La Haine, which is a film set in the suburbs, La banlieue, in black and white, engaging with police persecution, harassment, the daily lives of 3 people on the margins, 3 men on the margins, young men. But we also have a film shot in the south of France. It's a Franco-Tunisian family. And here we now are seeing a cinema about integration, posing questions about immigrants integrating into France. These are the important questions of the day. These are what establishes these films as important and specific to France. And what we're seeing in this film are essentially long takes of people eating couscous for 3.5 hours. Now that might not sound particularly interesting, and the actors were certainly sick by the end of, literally, by the end of the shoot. But the fact is that this is about immersion, our immersion into these long takes, into the reality of their lives. And they're talking about their lives. They're talking about being laid off. They're talking about, racism. And the film, by offering these long takes, is allowing us to think about integration. So the link there between, on a formal level, immersion, and on a thematic level, integration. These are some of the things that are being explored in this film, which makes it so important. So if you just look at the 4 periods, they're all very different, but there are links, connections all the time. We're asking the question, how are these films engaging with the reality of their period? So these are big, bold, often beautiful films, establishing what makes French cinema unique within global world cinema. It's a fascinating ride, and I hope you'll be able to take it.